Hello and welcome to The Last Hike. Today I'm covering content creators who step into Death Valley for content and quickly learn that it doesn't care about cameras. 5 people enter the same stretch of desert for completely different reasons. None of them are connected, but what happens to each of them starts forming a pattern you don't want to see too closely. It was June 22nd, 2013, in Death Valley National Park. The Badlands there are a maze of clay ridges and gullies. From above, it can look flat and harmless, especially in satellite images, but on the ground, it's very different. Everything reflects heat, and the pale rock just throws it right back at you. It builds fast, and it gets intense. Melanie Cosley. She was 26, a travel and lifestyle creator based in Phoenix. She was really into desert photography, that off-grid, hidden place kind of aesthetic. Her boyfriend, Jovan Thill, 29, sometimes helped her film, but he didn't have much experience in extreme environments like that, especially not dry desert heat like Death Valley. A few weeks before the trip, Melanie finds a drone clip online of the Badlands and assumes it's something remote, like a proper backcountry hike. But in reality, it wasn't. It was shot near a roadside pullout, just a short walk from the car. I get why that mistake happens, because from above, everything in that terrain can look way more isolated than it actually is. Still, she treats it like this hidden, untouched landscape. She lines up a small sponsorship for a shoot, planning it around that golden hour light. And she doesn't really check in with park staff or fully take in just how extreme the heat can get there. This is why I start thinking about how often people underestimate just how aggressive that heat gets. On arrival, they carried minimal water and entered the terrain in temperatures exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit. What appeared as open ground quickly broke into steep gullies and narrow clay ridges, forcing repeated detours. Navigation based on a saved satellite image soon became unreliable due to a lack of stable reference points. As they moved deeper into the Badlands, the environment shifted from difficult to disorienting. Gullies deepened into narrow channels that required constant climbing, descending, and backtracking. Their position relative to the road became increasingly uncertain. Water supplies declined faster than anticipated, while early heat strain began to affect both individuals, marked by fatigue, reduced coordination, and slowed decision-making. By the middle of the afternoon, they reach what they think is the right ridge, but it's not. It's a smaller outcrop, still a few hundred meters short of their goal. From there, things get more serious. A drop-off, then more exposed terrain that's rough even in normal conditions, and worse in that heat. By this point, they're already running low on water, not just a bit low, but critical. I'll be honest, seeing how little water they had here changes how I read everything that follows. The ground is also just soaking up heat and throwing it back up, making everything feel even worse. This is where Melanie decides to keep going instead of turning back to the road, thinking they're close enough to finish. But that choice keeps them out longer, more climbing, more exposure, less water, and heat stress that keeps building without easing. Thill began to show clear signs of heat exhaustion, including headache, nausea, and diminished sweating. Melanie attempted to manage their remaining water, but physiological decline was already underway. Within a short period, Thill's condition progressed to heat stroke, marked by confusion and loss of coherent speech. Melanie attempted to reverse course toward the road, but the terrain no longer matched her reference points. Every route ended in dead ends or impassable gullies. As her condition worsened, she also developed symptoms of severe heat illness, including dizziness, confusion, and impaired judgment, further reducing her ability to navigate. As temperatures peaked, Thill collapsed first and became unresponsive. Melanie attempted to move him into the limited shade of a gully wall, but conditions were no longer survivable in place. His condition deteriorated rapidly, and he died later that evening from hyperthermia and organ failure following prolonged exposure to extreme heat. Melanie remained with him for a period of time before attempting to retrace their route toward the road for help. However, by this point, she was also experiencing advanced heat stroke symptoms, including confusion, impaired judgment, and severe dehydration. Her movement became increasingly erratic, and she lost reliable orientation within the branching drainage system. This is one of those points where even a familiar route doesn't really exist the same way anymore. It just turns into disconnected pieces that don't line up. She was later found in a separate section of the Badlands after collapsing during attempted self-evacuation. She died from severe hyperthermia and dehydration after prolonged exposure and heat stroke, with investigators noting that cognitive decline likely occurred while she was still attempting to navigate out rather than after sustained independent travel. Rescue teams arrived the following morning. Thill was recovered from the original shelter site, while Melanie was found further along the drainage system. Both fatalities were attributed to extreme heat exposure, insufficient water supply, and delayed evacuation from hazardous terrain. An official review concluded that the incident resulted from a combination of factors, including insufficient water supply, off-trail travel in hazardous terrain, reliance on non-verified digital navigation, and delayed response to escalating heat illness. The case was later used in safety briefings highlighting how rapidly desert environments can become life-threatening when exposure, dehydration, and disorientation occur simultaneously. It was September 7th, 2018 in Death Valley National Park. A remote stretch of dunes, dry washes, and unmaintained tracks formed an exposed corridor where survival margins narrowed under late summer heat. Pale sand and clay reflected intense heat with little shade or landmarks beyond the road. Kashan Oren was 31, based out of San Diego. He was big into endurance running, the kind of guy who turns long desert runs into content for his audience online. He had experience with distance and training, but Death Valley, especially sustained heat like this, was something he hadn't really tested himself in before. His logistics partner, Brent Messias, 34, helped set things up: route planning, support setup, and a mid-route water cache to make the attempt possible. A few weeks before the run, Kashan picks a 38-mile Death Valley route after reviewing satellite images and online footage. It looks doable to him, like a solid one-push endurance challenge. If it were me, I'd be careful how much I trust something like this off satellite images alone. I also start thinking about how much detail doesn't carry over when everything is flattened into a screen view. He even turns it into a live stream event, with planned water drops along the way. And there's also this underlying pressure trying to prove himself again after earlier criticism that didn't sit right with him. The planning underestimated how quickly Death Valley conditions intensify under direct sun, and how misleading satellite imagery can be in showing elevation and drainage. I keep thinking about how clean everything looks on a screen compared to how unstable it actually is. On the morning of the attempt, he began the run on livestream with steady early progress, but as temperatures rose, reflected heat from the pale terrain rapidly increased physical strain. By late morning, Oren's water consumption increased faster than planned, and his pace began to decline. Viewers noted visible strain through the livestream, including longer pauses and reduced clarity in speech. Despite this, he continued forward, emphasizing that stopping would compromise the attempt and the commitment made to his audience. A critical failure occurred at the first scheduled supply point along a desert road crossing. The water cache, intended as a primary hydration resupply, had been placed at an incorrect junction due to a mapping error during setup. When Kashan arrived, the supplies were absent. After an extended search of the area, he was forced to continue with significantly reduced hydration. At this stage, dehydration began accelerating, and early heat illness symptoms emerged, including confusion, impaired judgment, and reduced coordination. Instead of retreating along the road, Kashan committed to continuing the route toward a secondary water source marked on his map, unaware it was unreliable and seasonally dry. By early afternoon, his movement had slowed to a strained walk. Speech became fragmented, and he began showing clear signs of progressing heat stroke. He consumed his remaining water and reached the mapped water source, which was completely dry. At that point, cognitive impairment was already advanced. Although he had emergency communication equipment available, he did not initiate a full distress signal immediately. His judgment was increasingly affected by dehydration, confusion, and a distorted perception of remaining capability, leading him to underestimate the severity of his condition. Instead of calling for evacuation right away, he tries to check himself first. Just a quick self-assessment, trying to figure out how bad things really are. Then he keeps moving a bit, slowly looking for anything shade, a better spot, somewhere he might get a signal or just be able to communicate more clearly. I'm just watching him burn time here, trying small fixes when the bigger problem is already set. But that choice ends up costing time, and in that window, things start to slip even more. His thinking gets less structured, harder to organize, and the delay builds on itself, making it even tougher to respond in a clear, decisive way. As his condition worsened, he struggled to complete basic operational steps under heat stress, including focusing on instructions and maintaining attention long enough to follow through with a full emergency transmission. By the time he attempted to escalate the situation, his cognitive state had already degraded to the point where communication was fragmented and incomplete. The delay meant that when emergency services were finally contacted through a third-party viewer, responders had to rely on limited, indirect location data rather than a precise real-time distress signal. This increased the time required to narrow the search area within the canyon system. Emergency services were alerted after a viewer contacted authorities during the live stream. Search teams launched immediately, with aerial units deployed once his last known location was confirmed through tracking data. Rescuers found him later that afternoon unconscious, showing signs of severe hyperthermia consistent with advanced heat stroke. Despite rapid cooling and evacuation to a regional hospital, his condition was irreversible, and he was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Investigators cited multiple contributing factors, including insufficient hydration planning for Death Valley conditions, a critical navigation error that mispositioned water supplies, and delayed emergency activation. The live stream was also identified as a contributing pressure factor, influencing continued exertion despite clear signs of physiological decline. The recording later circulated widely, prompting renewed scrutiny of endurance challenges in extreme desert environments and the risks of prioritizing performance over survival limits. It was April 14th, 2023. A remote section of Death Valley National Park formed a network of canyons, dry washes, and broken ridgelines where navigation errors could quickly lead to isolation. The terrain included narrow limestone cuts, unstable talus slopes, and dry drainages with seasonal or unreliable water sources. Jonah Okoye, 34, was a Texas-based content creator running a channel testing new tech in real-world settings. He was especially focused on AI tools, basically seeing if they could actually handle planning trips, not just generate them on paper. For this project, he used an AI travel assistant to build a full wilderness route with almost no input from him. I keep noticing how easy it's become to treat AI output like it's already been checked for facts, even when it hasn't. A few days before the trip, he accepts an AI-generated Death Valley route with canyons, a mapped water source, and a ridge connection, treating it as a controlled test without really adjusting or questioning it. The plan looked structured but had major issues that weren't caught before departure. A seasonally dry water source, altered routes from erosion and flash flooding, underestimated hydration needs, and a ridge section requiring technical talus movement. None of it was independently verified. A park ranger briefly warned him that water in the area was uncertain, but he proceeded anyway. He entered the backcountry with limited water, standard gear, and no emergency communication device. Once past the trailhead, cell service dropped as he moved deeper into the canyon system under rising temperatures. I've seen that moment before where the connection just disappears and you're fully on your own after that point. Early progress through the drainage network was steady, though an unexpected washout forced an unplanned detour across unstable debris fields. The added distance and physical effort increased exertion beyond initial projections. By late morning, as ambient temperatures climbed and solar exposure intensified, his rate of hydration consumption increased significantly. As the terrain opened into exposed sections of sand and fractured rock, heat reflected upward from pale surfaces, compounding thermal strain. Fatigue began to accumulate, and rest intervals became more frequent. Despite these signs, Jonah continued along the planned route, relying on the assumption that the next waypoint would provide relief and replenishment. At the mapped water source, Jonah found only a dry basin, as the AI had incorrectly assumed seasonal flow. With no nearby alternatives and reduced reserves, he documented the failure on camera but continued the route, prioritizing completion of the experiment over retreat. Overnight conditions allowed limited recovery, but the next segment proved more severe than expected. The ridge connection required sustained climbing over unstable talus and fractured rock, increasing exertion and fluid loss at a critical stage. During the ascent, he slipped and struck his knee on exposed stone, significantly reducing mobility. From that point, both ascent and descent became hazardous due to injury, fatigue, and unstable terrain. His remaining water soon ran out, and he became increasingly disoriented with no reliable communication. He recorded a short video describing his condition before attempting a descent, but progress was slow and limited by injury and exhaustion. Concern was raised when he failed to return on schedule and his vehicle remained at the trailhead, prompting a search operation across the canyon network with ground teams and aerial reconnaissance deployed. That short recording ends up being the only thing I have to go on once everything else goes quiet. He was eventually located in a lower drainage zone, conscious but severely dehydrated, with a swollen knee and limited mobility. His condition was critical, with signs of advanced heat illness compounded by prolonged exposure and fluid loss. Although ground teams reached him and began assisted movement out of the canyon, his condition deteriorated rapidly during extraction. The combination of severe dehydration, exertional heat stress, and inability to stabilize his body temperature led to collapse before evacuation could be completed. He was pronounced dead shortly after being transferred to a ranger-accessible point, with medical assessments citing hyperthermia and multi-organ failure consistent with prolonged heat exposure and exertion under dehydration. The incident was later classified as a high-risk backcountry fatality, driven by reliance on unverified algorithmic route planning, compounded by inaccurate environmental assumptions, insufficient emergency preparedness, and delayed effective response once incapacitation occurred. Officials emphasized that digital navigation tools cannot replace field verification in remote desert environments where conditions can shift rapidly. It was July 10th, 2015. Surprise Canyon in Death Valley National Park was a narrow, rock-walled drainage where confined terrain and extreme heat quickly intensified conditions. Sunlight reflected off canyon walls, limiting shade to brief, shifting pockets. Jackson Dubois, 38, was a Colorado-based outdoor content creator running a gear testing channel focused on field performance under extreme conditions. His collaborator, Nadia Mbeki, 35, was a photographer assisting with documentation, with limited formal wilderness experience but strong general fitness. The expedition was structured as a sponsored product evaluation of heat-adaptive outdoor equipment, with deliverables tied to documented real-world performance and field footage expected for post-production review. Prior to the trip, Jackson tested a cooling vest, hydration system, solar charger, and lightweight footwear under controlled conditions with limited environmental stress, reinforcing confidence in their reliability. However, those tests did not replicate sustained exposure in a confined desert canyon, where radiant heat from rock surfaces, ground temperatures exceeding 150 degrees Fahrenheit in exposed sections, and restricted airflow sharply increased physiological strain over time. My impression here is that the testing setup and the actual environment just feel like two completely different worlds. The pair entered Surprise Canyon early in the morning with a 2-day water supply intended for moderate exertion and planned filming stops. Initial progress was steady with intermittent shade, but rising sun quickly intensified heat as canyon walls began reflecting radiation into the narrow corridor, creating sustained exposure even in partially shaded sections. By mid-morning, the cooling vests start to lose effectiveness. The phase change material inside them is basically spent, so at that point it's just a slight surface cooling effect, nothing that actually helps with the core body heat anymore. They're sweating heavily too, both of them, and that's speeding up dehydration fast. On top of that, the terrain keeps forcing constant effort, uneven ground, short climbs, all within the canyon floor, so there's really no chance to settle or recover. A solar charger they set up around midday also doesn't hold up well. The extreme heat causes it to overheat and shut down intermittently. So instead of steady power, it only gives short, unreliable bursts of charging. By early afternoon, they reach a planned rest point. Water is already running low, and early signs of dehydration are showing headache, fatigue, slower thinking. But at the time, it still just feels like normal exertion, not something that calls for turning back. It reads to me like things are starting to feel routine even while they aren't. They decide to push on to an upper canyon section for more documentation anyway, staying out through the peak heat window when the sun's radiation is at its strongest. On the way back, things start to fall apart faster. The heat stress and dehydration don't level off, they stack. Then one more issue hits. Jackson's footwear starts breaking down. The adhesive softens in the heat and the sole begins to separate, which makes movement unstable. Every step takes more effort, slower, and more careful, right when fluid levels are already critically low. Shortly afterward, both individuals exhausted their remaining water supplies. Nadia developed acute gastrointestinal distress alongside worsening heat illness, forcing repeated stops in minimal available shade. Cognitive function declined in both individuals, with impaired decision-making, reduced situational awareness, and slowed response to environmental cues. Communication systems initially failed due to lack of signal within the canyon and device limitations under thermal stress. As conditions deteriorated, Nadia managed to reach a higher ridgeline and briefly establish emergency contact, transmitting location data and initiating a rescue response before her condition worsened further. Me seeing her having to climb just to get signal really highlights how a location alone can control whether help is even possible. While awaiting rescue, Jackson's condition rapidly progressed from heat exhaustion to severe heat stroke. He became disoriented, unable to maintain coherent speech, and lost the ability to regulate body temperature. Core physiological collapse followed sustained hyperthermia and dehydration. Rescue teams arrived after several hours via coordinated ground and aerial deployment. Nadia was located first in critical condition and evacuated, while Jackson was found shortly after in a lower drainage segment, unresponsive, with signs consistent with advanced heat stroke. Despite rapid cooling efforts and emergency transport, both individuals' conditions had progressed beyond recovery. Jackson was pronounced dead shortly after evacuation due to hyperthermia and multi-organ failure from prolonged exposure, exertion, and dehydration. Nadia also succumbed to severe heat stroke and organ failure during emergency treatment at a medical facility. In the aftermath, investigators identified multiple contributing factors, including reliance on controlled condition equipment testing, underestimation of radiant heat amplification within confined canyon geometry, continued exertion during early physiological decline, and delayed emergency activation due to communication constraints. The incident was later cited in outdoor safety analyses as a case demonstrating how gear performance claims and controlled testing environments cannot substitute for real-world thermal load assessment in extreme desert terrain. It was October 5, 2021. The Grapevine Mountains in Death Valley National Park formed a remote canyon system of fractured volcanic rock and narrow drainages, where small navigation errors could quickly lead to isolation due to distance and lack of visible reference. Points once off the main track. Theo Barsanti, 41, was a California-based documentary creator running a YouTube channel focused on abandoned sites, mining history, and forgotten infrastructure. While experienced in basic exploration, his recent work had increasingly become audience-driven, with expeditions shaped by viewer interest, narrative structure, and production timelines rather than purely logistical caution. For months, Barsanti had been pursuing a potential forgotten mining structure based on early 20th century archival photographs. After narrowing its possible location through historical mapping, he identified a remote canyon system in Death Valley as the most likely site. He framed the expedition for his audience as a discovery-focused field mission. Honestly, I'd already be cautious here because once a route is built off historical fragments like this, there's a lot of room for gaps between the map and the actual ground. Although presented as carefully planned, key decisions were influenced by content timing and narrative continuity. The destination was only generally disclosed, preserving suspense for later release. He departed before sunrise, reaching the canyon approach via a rough four-wheel drive track. His vehicle was not well suited for sustained off-road conditions, but he proceeded under the assumption that the route would remain passable based on limited prior reconnaissance and earlier satellite reference points. Looking at this, I'm already uneasy about relying on assumption in terrain like that. As the track deteriorated, repeated impacts and uneven terrain caused mechanical strain, eventually leading to a tire failure. After a temporary roadside repair, he continued deeper rather than retreating, influenced by time pressure and the expectation of reaching the target site within daylight hours. At a narrowing section of the access route, the vehicle became high-centered in an erosion channel and could not be moved in either direction. He was stranded several miles from his intended staging point, with limited water, no reliable communication, and a destination still farther inside the canyon system. At this point, Barsanti made a critical decision, influenced by both logistical pressure and content continuity. He abandoned the vehicle and continued on foot while documenting the situation. This marked the transition from planned travel to unsupported backcountry movement. Initial foot travel was slow but manageable as he entered the drainage system. However, the canyon quickly split into multiple visually similar branches, making route tracking increasingly uncertain. Without stable signal or reliable landmarks, navigation depended on memory and intermittent visual cues from earlier filming. By midday, he reached the mining site he had been searching for, wooden structural remnants and stone foundations built into the canyon wall. The discovery confirmed his research and became a key content milestone. He spent extended time filming and photographing the site, gradually consuming less water than conditions required. This reduced his reserves earlier than planned for the return journey. After completing documentation, he began his return. However, the canyon's branching structure created subtle directional errors, and he soon entered unfamiliar drainage paths. The loss of phone power eliminated digital navigation, forcing reliance on visual memory under increasing heat stress. As he retraced his steps, repeated dead ends, forced backtracking, increasing exertion, and delaying progress, fatigue accumulated, and dehydration and heat exposure began to significantly impair judgment of distance, time, and direction. I just keep picturing him looping back through the same dry cuts and not realizing how much ground that actually adds up to. During a descent over unstable talus, he slipped and sustained a severe ankle injury that sharply reduced mobility. The injury turned a routine return into a prolonged and physically demanding exit through unstable terrain, increasing exertion, and accelerating fluid loss. As daylight faded, he briefly re-established visual recognition of a known ridgeline and managed to reach his vehicle in the early evening, significantly dehydrated, injured, and in clear physiological distress. After restoring limited phone functionality using remaining battery reserves, he contacted his spouse and transmitted his location, prompting an emergency response. A ranger unit was dispatched and arrived after a delay due to distance, road conditions, and limited nighttime access. He was found in the vehicle in critical condition, showing signs consistent with severe exertional heat stroke. Despite immediate field treatment and rapid evacuation toward medical care, his condition deteriorated during transport due to progressive hyperthermia and multi-system failure. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at a medical facility. In the aftermath, investigators identified cumulative risk factors including limited route sharing, solo travel, extended content capture periods, and reliance on incomplete communication redundancy. The incident was later cited in discussions on influencer-driven fieldwork, where production pressure and narrative continuity were identified as contributing factors in operational decision-making under hazardous desert conditions.